Imagine a world before banks, before loans, before the idea of debt even had a name. People traded grain for cattle, tools for cloth, labor for food. Value was simple, tangible, and immediate. But humanity has a strange talent. We don't just exchange objects, we exchange promises. And it was this invisible promise, this little spark of trust, that quietly started a revolution far bigger than any empire. The earliest credit wasn't a number, it was a relationship. A farmer promising to return grain after the harvest. A merchant taking goods today and paying after the caravan returned. A village scribe recording who owed what on clay tablets. Over time, these promises became too many to memorize, too complex to track, and too valuable to lose. So communities began to formalize them, turning trust into a system. This was the birth of the first credit kingdoms, long before kings or governments controlled money. Small groups, often powerful trading families or temple authorities, became the guardians of these records. They weren't rulers by force, but by ledger. Whoever controlled the record of debts controlled the community's future. And for the first time in history, power shifted from land and weapons to something far more subtle: the power over promises. Soon, credit was no longer a friendly arrangement. It became an engine. Merchants expanded trade routes because credit allowed them to buy before selling. Farmers grew more crops because loans allowed them to plant more fields. Cities grew. Civilization expanded. And the families who understood credit became the silent architects of progress. What started as simple trust slowly evolved into a global force, the foundation upon which every modern economy rests. The Credit Dynasty had not yet taken shape, but the blueprint was already written in clay, ink, and human ambition. As trade routes stretched across continents and empires began to thirst for expansion, a new kind of power emerged. Not kings, not soldiers, not priests, but families who understood something deeper than conquest. Control the flow of credit, and you control the destiny of nations. These weren't ordinary families. They were merchants, bankers, gold traders, and financiers who slowly realized that wealth wasn't in the coins themselves. It was in the ability to decide who gets the coins. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, certain lineages gained reputations for reliability, secrecy, and unmatched financial intelligence. Over generations, they transformed from traders into trusted lenders for merchants, city-states, and eventually, kings. The five families who would eventually shape the modern economy weren't united by blood, culture, or geography. They were united by something stronger: the mastery of lending power. When monarchs needed money for wars, they didn't turn to their treasuries, they turned to these families. When trade caravans needed funding, when ports needed expansion, when entire nations needed stability, the same names kept appearing behind the scenes. Soon, kings became clients, not rulers. Empires that once expanded through armies now expanded through banknotes. The influence of a family vault could outweigh 1,000 soldiers. Every treaty, every exploration mission, every industrial venture depended on credit, and credit depended on them. These families learned to operate in shadows, using networks of agents, secret correspondence, and coded ledgers. They understood risk better than generals and strategy better than diplomats. Their decisions could trigger prosperity or collapse. By the 17th and 18th centuries, they were no longer just wealthy, they were indispensable. They didn't just participate in economies, they designed them. Their fingerprints rest quietly on the foundations of central banking, bond markets, currency systems, and international trade. The age of kings was fading. The age of credit families had begun. Once the five families had secured their foothold in the world of finance, they began constructing something far more powerful than any physical kingdom. An invisible empire built not of stone and armies, but of contracts, debts, and influence networks that stretched across borders. Unlike monarchs, these families understood a crucial truth: real power doesn't need a throne, it needs access. Access to rulers, to trade, to information, to gold, and eventually, to the new invention that would change everything: paper money. This wasn't just wealth. It was a system of control that operated quietly, beyond public view. To build this financial empire, the families created a network of private banks, merchant houses, and lending offices that connected major commercial hubs: London, Amsterdam, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, Venice, Istanbul, and beyond. Wherever ships docked, caravans arrived, or armies marched, their agents were already present, offering credit, converting currency, gathering intelligence. This network allowed them to do what no king or emperor could: predict the future by controlling the present. They financed wars from both sides, ensuring profit regardless of victory. They built early insurance systems to reduce risk and increase dependency. They standardized lending practices, turning chaotic markets into structured systems. And because they controlled the flow of information, they often knew about political events before governments did. Their most powerful tool became something subtle: intergenerational strategy. Unlike kingdoms that crumbled when a king died, their plans stretched across centuries. Each generation inherited not only wealth, but a blueprint. Marriages were strategic, alliances were mathematical, partnerships were geopolitical. By the 18th century, their influence was so deeply rooted that governments could not function without them. National debts were essentially lifelines held in private hands. Central banks were shaped, funded, and guided by their expertise. The modern financial world, stock markets, bonds, credit cycles, all grew from seeds they quietly planted. They didn't conquer territory. They conquered dependency. And through dependency, they built an empire no army could overthrow. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the five families had mastered credit, war financing, and international trade. But they were ready for their ultimate creation: a system that would allow them to control entire nations without ever stepping into political office. That system was the central bank. Central banks were presented to the public as stabilizers, protectors, and guardians of national economies. But behind the curtain, they served a very different purpose: to give private families the ability to influence governments through debt. When a nation needed money for war, infrastructure, or political survival, these families stepped in, not as donors, but as lenders. And lenders always wrote the rules. The brilliance of central banking was in its design. Instead of loaning money directly to kings and governments, the new system created a permanent institutional middleman: a national bank that controlled currency, credit, and long-term economic policy, and who advised, shaped, funded, and quietly directed these banks. The same families that had dominated European finance for centuries. This shifted power from thrones to tables, boardroom tables, from royal decrees to interest rates, from crowns to signatures on paper. Governments became dependent not only on borrowing but on monetary stability, which the central banks controlled. Wars became easier to fund. Crises became opportunities. A recession in one region could be used to expand influence in another. And because central banks operated behind complex financial language, the public had no idea who truly benefited. By the time the 20th century began, the model had spread worldwide, from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve in the U.S., from Europe to Asia. And with every new central bank came an identical result: the concentration of monetary power in private hands, invisible to voters, untouched by elections, and immune to political change. It was the perfect dynasty, one where power passed quietly through ledgers instead of bloodlines, and control was exerted not through force, but through the simple, silent mechanism of debt. By the 21st century, the original five families no longer operated in the open. Their names rarely appeared on wealth lists, and their influence was almost never discussed in mainstream media. But their power didn't disappear, it evolved. Today, it operates through a global network of investment firms, central banks, multinational corporations, and international institutions that quietly shape the world economy. The dynasty's greatest achievement was shifting from visible wealth, castles, gold, land, to invisible wealth, derivatives, offshore trusts, bond markets, and digital capital flows. Through this transformation, they ensured that while countries change leaders every few years, the economic architecture never changes at all. Modern institutions like the IMF, World Bank, ECB, and the Federal Reserve form a coordinated ecosystem that influences interest rates, currency values, and national policies. Meanwhile, private giants, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, UBS, and others, hold significant stakes in nearly every major company on Earth. This creates a circular system where the same elite networks influence governments, corporations, banks, and markets simultaneously. The result is a subtle but absolute form of power. No thrones, no crowns, no emperors, just ownership. If a country collapses economically, they buy it. If a currency inflates, they trade it. If a new technology rises, they fund it. If a market crashes, they profit from the downfall. The modern economy may look democratic, but behind the curtain, it is still guided by the blueprint designed over 200 years ago, a system built not on production, but on contract of credit, shaping the world quietly, permanently, and without resistance.